I didn't know her novels. I love books and I love Victorian books, but I had never read her, partly because she used to be published as Mrs. Gaskell, which made me think that she must be quite old-fashioned or it might be quite staid, and in fact she's incredibly modern in her writing.
She writes very realistic characters, they're very straightforward, and what she doesn't do, which I really love about her, she never judges her characters.
Mrs. Gaskell has an eye for the detail and an eye for the minutiae, not just of how people live their lives, but how they feel and experience their lives. And she's a great chronicler of life.
She has dialogue somehow that can sound exceedingly modern. She was, I think, ahead of her time in that way. And we've had people say, oh, you shouldn't have modernized this script. That sounds a bit modern. And we'd say, it's actually from the book.
A new, young doctor is coming to live in our midst, and Dr. Morgan has arranged a house for him. It'll be kept by a widow who will not arrive for a fortnight, was married to another doctor and knows all about disease and surgery. So, what do you think to all of that?
There's not sufficient sickness here to keep them entertained.
Dickens probably is more heightened. The Brontes are probably more passionate. Jane Austen is possibly more witty. But I think there's something about Elizabeth Gaskell that pulls together aspects of all of that and really opens up a world for you, and a world of truth and feeling and honesty, which makes her very engaging, I think, and very human scale.
You can be laughing at a character and then moved within a beat because you understand, you are sympathetic to that character. They might seem at that point to be ridiculous, but she can turn you around so that you are then incredibly touched by them.
As a young woman living in 2007, to read and imagine these incredible females that she creates, I don't think we have a rival for her now.
By taking the men away physically, by literally not having them there, and by having the ones who are there being slightly hopeless, she creates this world in which the women take the decisions, in which the women play the roles normally played by men.
She was a social reformer. She believed in equality for women, and she wrote with great humour about that, which I think cut through a lot of red tape and male bigotry, because they didn't understand it. So in that respect, she was, along with Austen and Bronte, I think she was up there as somebody who was very much ahead of her time.
She's interested in similar themes about continuity and change. She was very interested in this idea that people in these small towns, before the railways come, and this is so much about the railway on its way to Cranford, it's creeping closer, and their fear of change and trying to hold on to things.
Put no further pastries to your lips, or you will choke when you hear the news I must report.
The railroad is to come to Cranford.
I'm not remotely sure that we should give this credence.
She's very interested in the idea of community and what is it that gives it the glue, or as Heidi wrote wonderfully in the script, the weave, this fine close weave.
The things Cranford deals with are timeless. It's to do with ties of community, ties of blood, the history of one's relationships, the way in which the history of your relationships affects your present. These are things that never change. And I think just on a level of society, I think we do still have close bonds within our society. I think people do still depend on their neighbours. Maybe not as much as they did in 1842, but I think those resonances are still there in society. I think some things never change, and people will recognise themselves in many of Gaskell's characters.
I read Cranford at school, and recently a neighbour of ours lent me a copy of it, and when I got the copy, which is a little red copy with a raised, a little oval with a raised portrait of Mrs. Gaskell in the corner, I remember that at school I used to lick my finger and press it against that and look and have the portrait of her, you know, the outline of her in my thumb. I remember that so well, terribly well. So I had, and I hope people will, if they see the adaptation, will want to read her.
I think it will show her books off in a very, very favourable light, and I'm sure the sales will rocket for the estate.
Sue Birtwistle very brilliantly came up with the idea of putting together these three Elizabeth Gaskell novellas, and in tandem with BBC drama production, they were developed into a serial, Cranford.
When I decided that I wanted to do Cranford, after doing Wives and Daughters, I read it again and I thought, well, I love this material, but it isn't enough to make into a huge piece of drama. So I started to read through a lot of the stuff that she had written, not only her novels but her short stories and her essays, and realised that there are some that are definitely based on the town of Knutsford and the people she knew. And out of all of those I chose two others. One is called Mr. Harrison's Confessions, which is about the new doctor that comes into this town, mainly full of older ladies. And the other one is called My Lady Ludlow, which is based on a character who does appear in her work a lot, which is the lady at the big house, who is set slightly further back in time. I was working with Susie Conklin, who I'd worked with as a script editor on Pride and Prejudice and Wives and Daughters. So I asked her if she would like to try to weave these books with me.
We decided on the three novels in the end, and then we thought, okay, how do we put this together? So we got packs of 3x5 cards, Sue and I, and color-coded them for the three novels, and we wrote the main story beats for each of the novels. She was in New York at the time, and so I went to New York, and we sat for several weeks in her apartment, and we just lay out these 3x5 cards.
Of course, when we started to lay them out, there were so many that we spread onto the floor, and we covered the entire floor with these cards. So we were on hands and knees saying, well, Dr. Harrison, it's the green cards, has got a bit too much in episode 1 or not enough in episode 2. So we'd literally shuffle them around. Can we move the bit about the cat into episode 3? And can we do the bit where Bella trips into episode 4, which she's not had the baby by then, so we have to shuffle it around.
And eventually that turned into the storyline that we wrote into Basic Beats, which was just the beginning point for Heidi. One of the first things Heidi said to us when she took on the job is she said, "You've married someone off twice." I said, that might have been a card we meant to take out of the card pack.
We took a lot of liberties with Elizabeth Gaskell. We lost characters, we gained characters, we shuffled story beats around, we added beats to the stories.
We did have to invent a certain amount of new material, but always making sure it was seeded in the original stories and backing it up with some historical research. Jenny Uglow, the historian and Gaskell's biographer, was enormously helpful in that regard. And for example, there were two characters, Mrs. Forrester, played by Julia Mackenzie, and her character is an amalgam of a character called Mrs. Forrester and a character called Mrs. Betty Barker. They both had different things to offer the plot, but because Mrs. Betty Barker was from a much lower social strata, she had originally been a lady's maid, we were unable to make her work with the other ladies quite as closely as we would like. So we amalgamated her with Mrs. Forrester, and then we had a character of some social standing who owned a cow and was very funny, but who could go into all the houses in Cranford.
Our bottom line was we have to stay true to the spirit of what she was doing. This was important to us, and to see if we had crossed a line. But we did end up changing characters, putting in some new ones, amalgamating characters, changing story. Some people who die who didn't, some don't die who did. I mean, things did change.
And we lifted out from her essay about her childhood two particular incidents, two comic incidents that weren't actually in the novels.
We co-created by doing this, by interweaving these together and creating this storyline, which could then be used for Heidi Thomas, who wrote the script, to then use that as her starting point.
The challenge was to make sure that we preserved Gaskell's magic, her intimate understanding of this very small, very particular community, and meld that with the other two new stories to create a new drama that was completely fresh.
It's easy to sort of sell it very quickly as something that's quite light and funny, but it really packs an emotional punch as well. And as those who know the material will tell you, there's a lot of tragedy in it. You know, it's a real portrait of a real town, and death and unexpected disappointment come frequently.
I think it's phenomenally adapted, really extraordinarily, because there's such a lot of it. it's just very, very informative about the time, and the stories are all interwoven beautifully. It's really inspired.
Well, it's a very modern syndrome, what they call multi-threading in America, where they run 2 or 3 stories concurrently against each other. And you see that, obviously, it was the Hill Street Blues thing that created that. And in a sense, shortcuts, Pulp Fiction, there are a lot of multi-threaded films and television events in modern culture.
What is unusual about it is that it's got a huge cast of leading actors, leading characters, and sometimes they're at the foreground of those stories. It's their main stories in all the episodes, but sometimes they appear as slightly minor characters in other people's stories. Of course, that makes it slightly difficult when you're filming, because Cranford, as we have created it, goes over the whole period of a year. So it's from summer 1842 to summer 1843. And because there are all these interwoven stories, we suddenly realise that every character appears in every location, in every season through the year, which logistically makes filming quite tricky.
A normal story is obviously about, you know, maybe 1 or 2 characters and you follow their story. But Cranford is about a village, a town, and each person within that town has their own story, and all of the stories in Cranford are interwoven. So to keep the track of all of those individual stories has been quite a challenge.
It was a very exciting opportunity for a director to marry that wonderful collection of characters in the material with an extraordinary group of actors. People often ask, you know, what's it like to direct someone as great as Judi Dench, and the answer is it's wonderful, because I mean, and most great actors have a theatre background, and they value the relationship with the director, they value the relationship with each other, the other actors, and with rehearsal. And as I say, working with this ensemble of actors has been a total delight.
For the last 3 weeks, I think probably I've had 2 scenes off in 3 weeks, doing 7, 8 scenes a day. And that, I mean, you have to be really on the ball. The spontaneity comes because that's our job. We could do that if you're waiting 2 hours. We could be spontaneous at the end of it. But it's just the question of doing the same amount and quality of stuff and hoping that you get it right.
I worked in a theatre called the Royal Court Theatre, and the man who ran that always talked about, he said, treat classics as new plays and new plays as classics. And this is a chance to do a classic as if it was a new piece of writing.
Gaskell wrote detail, so it was really, we felt the art department was to bring that to the screen. So the detail became the most important thing. So from the faded wallpaper to the peeling paintwork to Lady Ludlow's lavish lifestyle, it was all about the detail. We decided on Laycock in Wiltshire to be our Cranford. Of the whole 5 parts takes place in one town, never goes anywhere else. And from there, the characters' houses and the development of all the look of Cranford came.
This is a model of Dr. Harrison's house. We tend to use models as discussion documents for the director of photography, producer, and we really use them in initial stages so that we can all plan and work out how we're going to do the shots, how we're going to light it, what the action's going to be.
We're shooting on the latest digital Genesis Panavision system, which is the same size chip as a 35mm camera, so it has that big movie look. I can shoot in really, really low light with candles or gas lamps and not really use any other types of artificial light sources, so the actors have much more freedom now than they've ever had before. I don't want to trick the audience. I want the audience to feel as though we're just in 1842. We've just been taken back there, and we can see every little bit of detail, but in this beautiful filmic way, you know.
I think what's wonderful about the cast we've got, they so enjoy the detail of the costume. Yes. They get real pleasure when they actually come to a costume fitting, and I used to try to come to them because it's such fun seeing them put on the details, the tiny bits of lace, the caps, every little detail, the mittens. Remember Judy putting on the mittens? And
no, it's sort of where we hope they find the character.
Yes.
And you can do so much.
Most of them do that.
Most of them do.
There's something really wonderful about doing costume drama because you get given this equipment with which to come at the part. You get given a costume that you're not familiar with, it makes you stand in a certain way, you get given a top hat, you get given things that make you feel more splendid.
The thing about Gaskell is that she's really detailed on what people wear, isn't she? And on fabrics. She's very particular about the details of things, isn't she?
She's very particular, which you kept in the script, which was a slight challenge occasionally, especially with red dresses and the like that came out.
And how many scallops they have on and what sort of hems they have and which lace trimmings they have.
Absolutely.
But she loves all the details of that. Do you remember Eileen?
Yes.
Eileen Atkins getting her shoes in this, and they were rather masculine long boots that stuck out from her feet, and she absolutely adored that, didn't she? She said, I know now what Miss Deborah's like. I know how she walks just by having the shoes on.
What I wear is several years earlier, because they feel quite correctly that she wouldn't necessarily have bought her clothes. She would be in her old clothes because they don't have very much money. The detail, the work that's gone in to that kind of...
And all these are all genuine, you know, that Jenny Bevan found.
It's the creativeness that goes in on top of the actual work that you can do anyway, but then their own creativeness of how would that character have then used their clothing.
Well, this is one of Mary Smith's frocks, which it's a little tricky on a hanger, but you might be able to see as much lower waist, much more modern, and really a completely different shape from the Francesca frock. But Mrs. Gaskell said that the ladies of Cranford were very independent of fashion. And so we have them variously through basically 40 years, each one hitting whichever period they sort of were at their heyday in.
It completely kicks you into another world, and you find yourself doing things physically, mentally, that you would just never do. But then there does come the point when you've got corset burn and bonnet fever, which I've probably got right now.
I find it an awful lot easier as an actor, having all this gear on. It makes you stand in a different way, it makes you react in a different way than other pieces I do where you're in jeans and a t-shirt and you can do what you want. I love the restraint that period drama imposes.
The older you get, the more silly you feel, really. You think, what am I doing as a 44-year-old man getting dressed up as somebody else? But no, actually, it's quite restricting, all the clothes you wear. It's all quite tight and compact, and so it makes you walk and act a certain way, which is quite useful for the period, obviously. Hence the Victorian garb. And the boots are quite funky.
I have to say, I really wanted to do the dog because I knew I had a friend who would do it rather brilliantly, and I just didn't want it to become... I wanted it to become something very special, as opposed to just something that happened, you know. I also really wanted to match it to the costumes that we were going to make for the actor who owns the dog. There is a marvellous moment when they are both together at the garden party, similarly dressed.
I love doing costume dramas. I just find it all really thrilling because I just love dressing up. It's as simple and shallow as that.
Mary Smith arrives in Cranford at the very beginning of the first episode. I think in many ways Elizabeth Gaskell is Mary Smith. Mary keeps a journal and she discovers Cranford at the same pace as the audience discover it. She's quite a modern young woman, and it is almost like stepping back in time arriving in Cranford for her, particularly with the two sisters, the Jenkins sisters.
We're sisters, but we have very, very different personalities. I'm the oldest, and I have obviously been the clever one, and yet because I'm a woman, my father hasn't taken, although I used to, I think, write out his sermons and things like that. And Judy is the
stupid one.
No, she's also the nicer one. She's much nicer. I'm very strict, and she has clearly a much warmer heart. I mean, I'm too... I must keep within the rules. Whatever happens, I mustn't slide away, and I feel as if I am the moral compass of the village, whereas Judy is much warmer-hearted and therefore more open.
But
that
much more
sometimes-
influenced by you, so it
Yes.
feels that, you know, there are many things I can't do that I might like to have done.
Sophie she's very intelligent and bright, and I think people like her because she doesn't entirely wear her heart on her sleeve, but she's a very honest person. And she's got a lot of responsibility in her life. You know, she's only sort of 19, 20, and she's basically brought up her 3 younger siblings for the last 6 years. And she's more or less the mistress of the house, you know, with her mother, because her mother died in childbirth. So she's got a lot on her shoulders, and I think when the new doctor comes to town, it's someone of a similar age that she can talk about other things rather than housework or children or dresses, or it's just, I think it's really it's a good thing for her when he comes.
Frank, he just comes in and falls in love with this beautiful girl he sees. I mean, she's almost the first person he sees in the village, and she's just this kind of pure beauty, and he's one of the only men in the region, and it's this strange town where there's no other men, and so he's like a kind of bit of meat in a piranha tank or something. You know, it's just the fact there's no other men around. So all the women under 35, under 45, are in with a chance at that point.
I'm very much putting the cat amongst the pigeons, because I've sold a big portion of land next door here to bring the railway in. And no one wants the railway to come, because Cranford, this little jewel, this little quiet bastion of old times, as the Duke of Wellington says, the railways cause the poorer people to travel more. So they all become tremendously concerned that all the riffraff from the local large town will come and start robbing them. So I'm now seen as a bit of an evil figure in the society for allowing the railways in.
This guy, Mr. Carter, is he's a complex one. He's a sort of self-educated man, and he's a reforming kind of character, and he emphasizes the importance of things like education for the lower classes, and the importance of learning, really.
I'm playing Lady Ludlow, the Dowager Marchioness Lady Ludlow, and she is the lady from the manor. She basically represents at a time of change, which is what Cranford is about, the oncoming time of change in the 1840s. She represents old conservative paternalism. You know, she's almost feudal. She feels that everybody works for her. But also at the same time, she's very, very aware of her responsibility towards them. She's a very, very kind person.
I think our characters are like sort of, you know, all the embroidery, all the colours of this particular Cranford cushion, that, you know, we are, you know, the lifeblood of the place. And I mean, all the, you know, the bigger events, you know, the young people falling in love and various things happening, but we are interwoven to all their lives. And I think we're just sort of the stable core.
Yes, we also introduce a lot of what's going on in the rest of the country. The railway arriving, one's attitude towards various things, one's attitude towards royalty, one's attitude towards the French.
So it's a glorious opportunity to have, you know, to have these sort of roles as well. I mean, also sort of, you know, really honouring the role for the older woman, which is so lovely for us, because they're proper bloody parts, you know. They're not just in the background doing stuff. It's proper, you know, wonderfully written, beautifully adapted by Heidi Thomas, wonderful parts.
I adored writing the character of Miss Pole. Yes, she was a favourite up to a point because she has an answer to everything. She's wonderfully articulate and very funny without meaning to be. Characters who mean to be funny, whether they're funny or not, are quite unattractive, but I did embrace Miss Pole. I lived inside Miss Pole, I have to say.
These two characters are together a lot, but I mean, the whole of the Cranford ladies are sort of spent all their lives together and are like a family, so they can be very grumpy with each other but very honest and truthful with each other, and then be very caring towards each other. So it is like a family.
Well, it's a bit like that offset as well. We've all known each other as actors for a very long while, so we're a bit tetchy, grumpy sometimes.
It was pouring with rain the other day at Ashrick, and we were all under a tent. And we'd all been reading the papers, and it went on and on this pause, and the rain, and they were doing something else. So we got a page of the newspaper each and had to tear it into certain shapes. And we said we'd have an exhibition afterwards.
You're all given a shape like a car, and then you all have to, you know, sort of just rip away at this newspaper while you create that shape. And Eileen Atkins is really bad at it, because if we said make a car, she'd make a boat.
Right.
Because it's such a huge cast, there's something like 25 principal actors in this, and such a distinguished cast. So it's kind of fun to be coming on set and seeing all these names. I think I'm the only one that isn't titled, actually. We'll see if we can change that in a few years.
We've had an absolute summer of fun because this cast is so utterly joyous.
We haven't overlapped an enormous amount, have we? Philip Glenister, I've never spoken to him.
They don't make a great deal of this sort of television, and so it's an extra treat to be able to play in a really, well, a great quality programme. And it's huge. I mean, everywhere we go on location, they virtually build villages for us to exist in, let alone the sets that, of course, that they've chosen. And it's just a marvellous job.
All the best actors have very strong instincts about a scene when they come on to rehearse it. And it's about marrying that to what everyone else is doing.
It is awe-inspiring to be working with this cast, but it's also, it's very easygoing because everyone's very confident. And so there aren't any egos to be battling with, and everyone's got great anecdotes, and we all play games when we're sitting around, and it's just dreamy.
I got told who the rest of the cast were, and you couldn't not want to do the job when you hear that they're all doing it. I'm finding it amazing to be doing a job with Judy and Eileen and Imelda and, you know, all of them. It's just incredibly exciting and really embarrassing sometimes, because I'll have a scene where it's mainly me talking and all these just most terrifying of all people ever sitting around watching me talking, and it turned out they weren't that frightening, and that they were all nervous too.
But what's unusual for a period piece, what we call a bonnet and bustle episode, is that it is really quite amusing. I think that their idiosyncrasies are very amusing.
It's a great soap opera, really. And it's lovely to have a piece that is waistcoated and bonneted and bustled and horsed that's actually very funny as well. There's some wonderful moments of farce in it, which I think is out of the ordinary for this type of period piece. So it's been great fun.
I think to sum Cranford up in a word, how it's different from other period dramas, I think there's great humility in it and great humour.
Classic roles are usually terrific parts. But I enjoyed doing it, but I just like the part I'm doing. You know, I enjoy doing what I'm doing. And each thing, you know, throws up something else I find I can't do. You know, some other difficulty. Something else I have to learn.
I think if you're asking me what is the best thing with this production, I have to say being involved in a production of such value in all departments. It's a good job, and everything is of a wonderful standard.
One of the joys of Cranford is that there's a remarkable array of characters, and I often think that's very helpful because different members of the audience will be drawn to different characters, so there should be somebody for everybody.
I think if it's a good story, then you want to tell it, and a story about change set in any period is worth telling.
We do actually have material in the Bible ready for a second series, should this one, should people want that.
In my mind, when I'm writing adaptations, there is always a sequel, because you have to know where the characters have come from, and you have to have a strong sense of where they're going after the final curtain, otherwise they can't be complete. And I would love to work with these characters again. I'd love to work with these actors again, and these heads of department, these designers. And it would be wonderful to think they might have some life after this, because we've put so much life into them in the first place.